My name is Erin Cameron, and I'm SACE's Development and Outreach Coordinator. Before we get started today, I'd like to just take a moment to review the basic functions of the control panel on your screen. If you'd like to minimize your control panel, just select the orange arrow in the left-hand corner and then select the arrow again to display the panel. To ensure sound quality, all attendee lines will be muted throughout the presentation, but we encourage you to please type in any questions you may have in the questions box on your control panel, and we will answer those at the very end of the presentation today. For those of you not familiar with Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, we are a regional organization focused on promoting responsible energy choices that create global warming solutions and ensure clean, safe, and healthy communities throughout the Southeast. We are a membership organization, and I would like to thank our members on this call and encourage those of you who are not members to please join us today. For ways in which you can become a member and get involved, please visit our website, cleanenergy.org, which is listed there on the slide. And now, to get us started today, I'm going to hand it over to SACE Executive Director, Dr. Stephen Smith. Steve?
Great. Thank you, Erin, and thank you, everyone, for joining. The Tennessee Valley Authority is a critical part of our region in the Southeast, touching 7 southeastern states. They're a unique entity, being a quasi-federal corporation, and they have a very unique structure where they do the generation and transmission, but then they have 155 distribution local power companies in the forms of munis and co-ops that spread the power across the 7-state region. We at the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy have a long history of working with TVA and engaging on issues around the Tennessee Valley Authority, and we are happy to share our insights along with some of our allies on this very important integrated resource plan that TVA is undertaking. As everyone knows, this is a very fluid time within the utility industry. There's a number of technologies that are coming online. There's a different growth profile coming out of the great recession that we've recently experienced, and there are a number of factors that are changing the way that utilities do business. And I want to give TVA some credit for at least rhetorically acknowledging this dynamic nature of the industry and actually struggling with some of these issues in the planning process. The other thing I want to acknowledge is that TVA has undertaken an IRP. We are fortunate enough to have a utility that I think considers integrated resource planning a key part of their planning process. Unfortunately, in other parts of the Southeast, namely Florida, we have some utilities that don't even engage in public integrated resource planning processes. And so we welcome the fact that TVA not only does an IRP, but they do a good job of involving a lot of different stakeholder interests. And a number of the SACE staff and then others and our allies have participated in the stakeholder process, and we want to recognize and acknowledge TVA for providing that venue and that opportunity. But as I was saying, with the dynamic nature of the industry and the changes that are going on, just rhetorically addressing the fact that the industry is changing isn't enough. You need to really incorporate that thinking deeply into your planning process. And you're going to hear, as we discuss some of the concerns we have with the IRP, that we feel like there's some things that TVA has done right, and there's some things that we think that TVA needs to modify before they call this a final IRP. Obviously, some of the things that TVA has done right is they continue to be aggressive in their retirement of dirty, old, inefficient coal plants, and that is absolutely the right direction. They are looking at a more balanced portfolio with a number of different options, and we welcome that movement of TVA to have more commitment to other resources besides just coal and nuclear plants, which has largely been the dominant generation in their fleet. Unfortunately, as this integrated resource plan was underway, TVA made some very big decisions about some of their coal fleet. Some of those decisions were retirements, which we agree with, but then the volume of replacement with other fossil fuels like natural gas, we think could have been more thoroughly analyzed, and we don't necessarily agree with the amount of natural gas replacement that has been done. We understand that natural gas is going to grow, but we also thought that on some of these decisions they could have done a better job of the analysis, and we think the IRP should have led them to a little bit of a different conclusion. We also have concern about the retention of the Shawnee coal-fired power plant. We'll get into that a little bit. That was done, and the modifications on the pollution controls. Clearly, we're concerned about energy efficiency. As you move from being rhetorically committed to working with customers about in this new energy paradigm and this new utility paradigm, it's going to take more than just talking about energy efficiency and saying all the right things about energy efficiency. You need to make sure you model and integrate the least cost planning into the least cost planning, the least cost resource. So we have some concerns that we'll get into over the course of this about how TVA has modeled energy efficiency. And we also believe that the renewable sector, particularly the wind, low cost, high capacity factor wind, is becoming available because of the technology, because of things like high voltage direct current line opportunities under development. And we believe that brings tremendous volumes of clean, renewable energy into the Southeast. TVA, as a federal entity and as a living laboratory for change, should be at the forefront of embracing these technologies, because this is a national commitment to see more high voltage direct current lines be developed, to see more clean energy be developed, and we would hope that TVA would have modeled that appropriately, and you'll hear some concerns we have about the way they've modeled some of those resources. So I want to turn it over to members of my staff and our allies, and they're going to get into great detail. We look forward to your comments, but remember, we're at the draft phase here. There's an opportunity for people to engage. We're providing you hopefully tools for you to participate in that engagement. We're hoping that TVA, through sensitivity runs and other work that they'll do in the coming weeks and months, will correct some of the errors that we're going to identify here and end up with a better end product. But it's going to depend on all of us to be engaged, active participants, to come in and provide knowledgeable, thoughtful comments to the agency, and we look forward to doing that. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Steve. This is Angela Garoni, Southeast Energy Research Attorney for SACE, and I'll be walking us through the webinar today. And we also have other SACE staff attending and available to chime in on specific resources, as well as Sierra Club, Beyond Coal Campaign, Tennessee staffer Jonathan Levincius will go in the end to explain how you can engage further around the IRP. So without further ado, for those, I just wanted to start with a background of, for those who might not be familiar with what an integrated resource plan is. It's a detailed plan outlining how utility will meet electricity demand into the future, about 20 years. It includes a forecast of the expected peaks and overall energy demand that the utility will need to meet, including a reserve margin for energy needs. And then I wanted to be clear that this IRP, the plan, it doesn't require TVA to make any actions. Rather, it sets up these energy scenarios and applies various strategies that are aimed at meeting the forecasted demand under each scenario. This is actually a slide from a TVA presentation, but this helps kind of see the path forward and also the path we've come from in the development of this draft IRP. So as you can see, it begins with inputs and frameworks that are assumed, and then they're analyzing and evaluation. These are traditional resource planning tasks. And then what's unique to TVA, because as Steve said, it's a quasi-federal corporation, they actually have to comply with the National Environmental Policy Act requirements, where they present the findings to the public, as they have now, and engage in a public comment period. And then once that public comment period is over, they reevaluate the plan based on that, and then they make their final recommendations. So this is another TVA slide, but just there's a lot of steps, so just want to be crystal clear on how it works. As you can see, the first step is to develop a load forecast, and then you define what your existing generation resources are. Then you establish a need for those resources, and then you identify all the options you have under your generation resources, and you analyze the various generation portfolios and come out with a selected preferred portfolio, which is the ultimate goal of the IRP. And as I said, because TVA is a federal entity that has to comply with NEPA regulations, and that means that also along with the draft IRP, a draft environmental impact statement has come out with the IRP. And this is especially important because as we've seen in the past, TVA uses the IRP environmental impact statement to rationalize decisions with power plants, retrofitting or retirement in the future, as we saw with, for example, the choice to put $1 billion scrubber on the Gallatin plant. So this is an important an aspect of the IRP process as well. So we've talked about load forecasts, and I just wanted to give a visual here. Once again, these are all TVA source graphs. So here you can see the various energy demand forecast for the different scenarios. So as you can see at the bottom, the 5 scenarios are laid out here, and you can see that depending on which scenario, you have either a higher or lower energy demand going into the future over the 20-year time period. And then this is another graph taken from the IRP. This just shows it a little differently. As you can see at the bottom, you have all the different types of resources, generation resources, and then it shows under each scenario what the assumed use of each scenario, each resources, going into the future. So as you can see, there's a current outlook, stagnant economy, economic growth, a decarbonized future, which means it assumes that there's a price on carbon, and then a distributed marketplace, which assumes that there's more distributed generation resources like solar in use. I wanted to also highlight, as Steve said, that TVA is unique in another way in that it really has a robust stakeholder engagement process around the IRP. Some of us working in other Southeast states know that this is pretty unique for a Southeastern utility. And they really go above and beyond the requirements under the statutes. So I just wanted to highlight a couple of the several stakeholder groups that are involved. So you have the main TVA IRP working group, which is made up of various stakeholders from across the valley who've been meeting throughout the planning period to develop this draft. And this is where SACE and allies have worked to provide TVA with the most updated data on clean energy resources so that they are then put into the model in a way that reflects reality. And then also there's ongoing TVA resource planning groups dedicated to both energy efficiency and renewable energy that plug into the IRP, but those are also standalone groups that meet outside of an IRP process as well. And then one of the newer groups involved is TVA's Regional Energy Resource Council, which was created about 2 years ago, and recently their charter was renewed. It's a Federal Advisory Committee Act group that serves as a direct advisory committee to the TVA board. And then also throughout, along with the direct stakeholder working group, they also have had public meetings where they've updated the public throughout the period, and they will continue this engagement process. And Jonathan Leventius will talk more about this later, but TVA will be doing a roadshow events around their service territory to share the results of the draft IRP. And so this is just a timeline just to kind of give everybody a sense of where we are and where we're going. So as you can see, the IRP was released March 9th. The roadshow events will be taking place between the 19th and the 22nd of April. The comment period officially ends on April 27th, and then both now and after the comment period, the IRP working group meetings will continue to go, and that's how Steve said there'll still sensitivity runs, and there's still opportunities to implement change with some of the concerns we have. So those will be ongoing, and then there'll be 2 TVA board meetings before the final IRP is done. So the one May 7th in Huntsville will be another good opportunity to share your concerns with the TVA board at the listening sessions at that meeting, and then the final approval for the IRP will come in the August TVA board meeting. So I just wanted to start off with general draft IRP findings, and then I'm going to be handing it over to some of our staff to talk more in depth about what we have the concerns with. But overall, TVA assumed a low energy demand growth of about 1% per year, which resulted in the finding that there was no additional need for new base load power. So you'll see down at the second to last bullet, that means that there's no more nuclear planned after the Watts Bar 2 reactor comes online, and there's no significant hydro changes either. Also, a good finding from the IRP is that the least cost plan, despite the fact that it doesn't optimize energy efficiency and wind as we think it should, it still appears to show that TVA will be able to meet the carbon emission reductions required by the Clean Power Plan. And you note that that means that it's TVA that will be able to comply, not necessarily Tennessee. It's a state-specific emission rate, and a TVA works across 7 states, but it's showing a good indication that TVA will be able to meet those emissions without a lot of cost. And then also, as Steve said earlier, the coal use of TVA is already, drastically reduced from historical levels, and is now continues to have the possibility of retirements in the longer term. We still have concerns with the decision, for example, to invest a lot of money in the Shawnee coal plant, but overall, the movement away from coal is continuing with TVA. And then lastly, we'll go a little bit more into detail of this, but solar is adopted and assumed, some correct performance capacity values, but it's adopted more gradually. And then in terms of energy efficiency and wind, as Steve kind of hinted at earlier, TVA likes to use this metaphor of a highway for what their IRP is trying to establish, which is basically your energy highway, and then the strategies give you a pathway to navigate that highway, and some lanes are faster, some lanes are slower, but it seems from what has happened with this draft IRP that right now their highway doesn't leave much room for energy efficiency or wind, and actually that the constraints that we'll dive into now, especially on EE, have made it actually more like a toll lane for EE on the highway. So I'm going to hand it over to Taylor Allred, our Energy Policy Manager, to talk more about the energy efficiency issues with the draft IRP.
Thanks, Angela. So one of the key concerns that we have with the draft IRP is TVA's treatment of energy efficiency. They have made a very high-minded claim that they're going to be modeling energy efficiency this round of IRP as a resource on equal footing with traditional generation resources. In theory, that would be a significant step forward, but in actual practice, the way that they've done it, there are major problems that are significantly constraining the amount of energy efficiency that is being captured by the model. So the result of that is that in practice, the 2015 IRP is not actually reaching the level that the 2011 IRP reached. Not only that, but in the time period since the 2011 IRP, TVA has fallen short. So it's really a step behind on a couple of fronts. Right now, TVA's programs are achieving around 1/3 of the 2011 IRP targets, and matters weren't helped in August when the board voted for a 25% across-the-board O&M budget cut, which equally applied to energy efficiency, which is the least cost resource. It's really the only area of spending where they're actively saving money system-wide for every dollar spent. So that was a pretty disappointing decision. And we were hopeful that going into the modeling runs for this IRP, there would be more of an opportunity to ramp that back up, but there are some significant concerns here. Right now, the IRP is hitting an energy savings target of about 0.6% of retail sales, and that's significantly trailing behind some of the regional leaders and especially the national leaders. So as you see on this next slide, TVA's 2011 IRP target was generally on target to position them as a national leader. Unfortunately, on the red bar, you see that the 2011 IRP target is a big drop and puts them behind what other southeastern utilities are already achieving. That includes Duke Energy and Entergy Arkansas, who Entergy Arkansas is starting to approach the 1% mark, which is really a significant benchmark for where we think utilities should be hitting. So next slide. So TVA is constraining energy efficiency on a number of fronts through its IRP methodology. One of those issues is that they're applying an unreasonable growth cap. By using a more reasonable cap, they could increase the amount of energy efficiency savings by as much as 70%. And I'll talk a little bit more about the details of what they could do differently. And then also the other big issue is that they're using a couple of methods to redefine energy efficiency as an expensive resource when in reality it is the least cost resource. Through all of these issues, they're essentially assuming energy efficiency is 3 times more expensive than it really is. They're using a tier method to account for block increases in cost as additional savings are reached over time. But unfortunately, the tier construction does not reflect reality. TVA is also inappropriately inflating the cost of energy efficiency by as much as 30% toward the latter years of the planning period to account for perceived uncertainties. And that's on top of their stochastic modeling, which is used to account for uncertainty in other resources. So in a lot of ways, they're essentially double counting for uncertainty and jacking up the price of energy efficiency and constraining how much gets captured in the model. Next slide. So here's an illustration of the growth caps and the impact in the first 5 years of the planning period, which is really the biggest issue here with the growth caps. For the first 5 years, they're limiting the growth of energy efficiency to 25% of prior year savings. So since they're at a relatively low level of savings now, that's a very, very restrictive constraint. And it's setting them up to where they're not going to be able to hit that 1% benchmark I mentioned until after 2021. So next slide. So here's an illustration of the tier system I mentioned. So each tier is allowed a certain number of 10 megawatt blocks per year. The first tier is allowed 9 of these blocks for residential and 4 blocks per year for commercial and industrial. The numbers differ by sector for tiers 2 and 3, and that's noted in a table in the IRP, but we ultimately kind of decluttered this a bit. As you can see, they've got the cost adders broken out for the tiers here, and in total, it really adds up to a big increase in costs for these incremental switches and savings up from tier 1 to tier 2 and tier 2 to tier 3. So TVA's energy efficiency growth caps, as I mentioned, are a significant problem, but it is reasonable to include growth caps. The problem is with capping by prior year savings. As an alternative, it would make more sense from a simplistic standpoint to cap based on prior year sales instead of prior year savings. And that would greatly alleviate the constraints in the early years, which is the greatest concern. The counter argument for a straightforward cap on prior year sales would be that it might not be restrictive enough in the latter years of the planning period. So here's one possible approach that could be used to solve that, with an inverse cap structure, if TVA were to assume a maximum program size of 1.5% savings as a percentage of retail sales, and then cap the growth at 20% of the difference between the current program savings level and the ultimate maximum, they'd be able to allow for reasonable incremental increases reaching that kind of maximum expected level, with, you know, creeping down toward the later years as less growth would be expected. So cost-effective energy efficiency needs to be fully utilized. This is a breakout of how efficiency is captured in some of the scenario models in the IRP, and you know, it's a bit restrictive. I won't break into too many of the weeds of the details here because there are a lot of moving parts, but I'd be happy to address this in Q&A. So on that note, I will turn it back over to Angela for the wind portion.
Great. And thank you, Taylor. That was really helpful. And we also have Simon Mahan on our staff, who's a renewable energy manager, and he's on here too. He's our wind expert. So Simon, feel free to chime in. But wind, as Steve kind of hinted at earlier, is another place that SACE is really concerned and allies are concerned about, with how the assumptions with both cost and performance, especially of the high voltage, direct current, high capacity wind that's becoming available to TVA. So, you know, ultimately the TVA, the draft IRP, fails to take advantage of cheap, reliable wind power, and it's because of the failure of TVA to adopt the most recent data, the best modeling data associated with wind. And this is an image. The image up here kind of explains how TVA evaluated 3 different wind resources, but they assumed excessive cost and low performance. So you can see here that through the years, the turbines have gotten larger and can capture more wind and are higher capacity. And so TVA used an older, almost 4 years, assumption of how wind performs, instead of looking to the future and how we know that wind turbines and wind technology will continue to increase both in capacity, performance, and then lower in cost. And so this slide asks the question, you know, will HVDC wind be TVA's least cost power supply resource? And we believe it should, along with energy efficiency, as some of the lowest cost resources available to TVA. So here we're using the example of a specific project that's being developed by Cleanline Energy. And this would be a high voltage direct current transmission line that would deliver wind from Oklahoma into TVA's service territory just north of Memphis, Tennessee. And Cleanline estimates that power will be at a cost of $40 per megawatt hour, which is quite cheap, and that it can deliver dependable on-peak capacity. So it's about 51% of capacity based on the total 3,500 megawatts that Cleanline is expected to deliver. So although the wind in Oklahoma is reliable during TVA peak hours, TVA's planning assumption is only giving it 14% credit. So it's greatly devaluing the credit of this low-cost resource. Additionally, there's another project, the Southern Cross wind project, and that's down, you'll see that is the bottom illustration. The one to the top right is Cleanline, and that one has a capacity to deliver on-peak energy of around 1,500 to 3,000 megawatts. And so then you ask the question, can wind really be developed in the valley as well? And the answer is yes. There are a couple of projects in the hopper right now across the territory. So here we've outlined some of them. And another benefit of in-valley wind is it can be sited on active or inactive farmland and provide additional resources to farmers, as it has in the Midwest, that actually helps kind of revitalize what would otherwise be uneconomic properties. And then also there are other projects. The next area is developing one northeast of Huntsville. And there's also another one that was proposed in Alabama, but it's currently blocked by some goings-on in the Alabama legislature. So Simon, I don't know if you had anything to add. We can also, Simon's going to be on for Q&A, specific wind questions if folks have those.
Yeah, sure, Angela. Thanks for that. Some of the things that were kind of highlighted throughout the TVA IRP that I did want to mention here while I've got everybody's attention on wind. First and foremost, TVA did do something which is really quite a novel and good thing, and we're very glad that they did, but they looked at wind as 3 different types of resources. They looked at wind through HVDC, so either through the Clean Line or the Southern Cross project. They looked at wind through existing transmission lines from MISO, so similar to the contracts that they already have. And then they also looked at wind being purchased from in the valley, so that's that would be similar to the projects in Alabama or in Western Tennessee. But when they ran the model, some of the interesting things that came out was that in some scenarios, no wind at all was going to be purchased over the course of the study horizon. And really what that means is that by the year 2033, the existing power purchase agreements that TVA currently has would be expired. So effectively, in some of these scenarios, TVA is saying that by the year 2033, again, in some of these scenarios, that they could theoretically have no wind at all on their within their portfolio, which seems a bit egregious. And as Angela mentioned, they were relying on some older data, particularly for the in-valley wind energy resources based on capacity factors, based on older technology, not kind of current state of the industry technologies, let alone near-term, even 5-year out technology that will be improving and costs will be reduced. So there are some very easy things that TVA can do to fix these problems. But as it stands right now, the numbers for wind energy just aren't getting picked up as what we would expect.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Simon. Thanks. So moving on from wind and energy efficiency, the solar piece of the IRP is a bit of a better story. So solar, the draft 2015 IRP, it supports the development of over 2,000 megawatts of new solar within the first 5 to 10 years. And this actually is occurring in the model despite TVA's assumption of a slightly higher than market price for solar. So despite that TVA is a little off on the assumptions there, it still shows a good amount of solar being adopted in the near term. Recently, TVA announced a utility scale solar project in northern Alabama that was low cost, 20-year power purchase agreement. They won't actually own the project, but they will purchase the power off of it. And TVA most likely could have gotten a even cheaper price on that if they had invested in a longer term, 35-year, let's say, PPA there. But it is a good announcement, a big announcement from TVA to start investing in utility scale solar, especially in Alabama. So utility scale solar, so we're talking about the larger projects and not distributed solar like people's rooftops. Those kind of require a lot of land, but there are plenty of brownfields and once again, poor quality agricultural land, as I referenced with wind, that can be used for these sites. And they also can be developed on rooftops, so large warehouse rooftops, of which the service territory of Tennessee has a lot of manufacturing warehouses where conditions are right, rooftop solar could be built there. So although not all solar should be developed at utility scale, so we definitely support distributed solar in the valley, it is the easiest resource to represent in the TVA planning process because it's within TVA's control. So next is just another chart, TVA's own graph here that shows really what's happening with renewable energy throughout the planning period. Or actually, this is where they would be in 2033, and each of these on the x-axis is showing strategies combined with scenarios and the resulting amount of renewable energy. So you'll see through this chart that utility solar becomes economic towards the mid-2020s, and between 1,000 and 4,000 megawatts of utility solar tracking is selected across all the cases. And as Simon said, unfortunately, the wind additions generally occur late in the study window, and actually seem to be still a small amount, even when they show in. And that could be changed if there is actually increased energy loads when we get to the reality of it, or if there are high prices for CO2 emissions. And this is another map from the IRP, but it shows really the top sites across TVA for solar. And as you'll see, the red stars are the top 10 sites, and so those are all in the western part of TVA service territory, where the sun works better with the tracking. And so a lot of those are in areas, that could become good sites for utility scale solar. And then also the solar for jobs and savings, the blue dots, you'll see these are fixed systems across the valley, and have a good average output, and they also help on peak. So solar is, TVA is recognizing that it's a valuable resource in the future for the valley. So before I pass it over to Jonathan Levincius, I just kind of wanted to show exactly what this means for the folks who are interested in selling renewable energy to TVA. Contracts for renewable energy will be driven by TVA's evaluation of the value of renewable energy to the system. So that's why it's important that TVA accurately reflect the true value of these resources. And currently, as Steve said, there's still a lot of room for change, and TVA is going to run sensitivity analysis, and the IRP working group is going to continue to meet. But if TVA's IRP assumptions hold, the wind projects will basically be energy only, which means that they'll be driven by avoided fuel costs primarily. And, there are some good prices, like the $61 per megawatt hour is what TVA is paying for that project in northern Alabama for solar. And that's a good example of the value for both in-valley wind or solar projects. It's a pretty low cost megawatt resource. Solar projects will be given capacity value, but it's not clear yet how much additional value they'll be giving. And so, an example is that that project could have been credited with some capacity value, which may have made it more valuable under TVA's modeling. So with that, I wanted to pass it over to Jonathan Levincius to kind of close this out and talk about next steps, and then we will go to Q&A. So Jonathan?
Thanks, Angela. So what's next? First, TVA is taking comment from the public on the draft plan through the end of April. Comments can be submitted online at tva.gov or by email, and you can see the web address there for to access those links. The Sierra Club and others, including SAFES, will be generating comments from our membership to share our views on the draft plan with TVA by that deadline. It's important to note, as Steve said earlier, this plan is a draft. TVA has engaged the public throughout the drafting and is encouraging the public to comment. So it's important that we file and register our views with TVA by the end of April. The IRP working group has been meeting for the last 18 or so months and provided TVA with feedback throughout the process. The stakeholder panel will meet in early April and again in May to review the draft plan and look at some of that new information that Angela mentioned, the sensitivity analysis. Quickly, TVA will post a final recommendation in the summer, and the board of directors will approve a final plan in August. So there's opportunity for engagement with the board of directors as well. As part of TVA's public and stakeholder engagement, TVA is hosting several public meetings across the valley over the next month. And last week, the first meeting was held in Chattanooga. At these meetings, TVA will explain the draft plan and take questions and comments from the public. These meetings will be held, as you can see on the slide now, in Knoxville, Huntsville, Memphis, Tupelo, Nashville, and Bowling Green. These venues give the public the opportunity to hear directly from TVA on the draft plan, thank TVA for its work thus far, and also recommend areas for improvement. And those are the areas we've been talking about on this webinar. I'd also note that Sierra Club and SACE are teaming up with other local groups in Knoxville, Memphis, and Nashville to host workshops for the public that explore these issues we're discussing today in more depth, and also outline some solutions to take to these public meetings that TVA is hosting across the valley. More information on those events can be found by contacting Angela, and I think Angela's email address will be at the end of the presentation. You can also get a hold of me through Angela. But again, these are opportunities, these public meetings, for us to make improvements to the suggest improvements to the plan, so we can get something final later this summer that we all can support, that to grow our economy, protect our environment in the Tennessee Valley going forward. Thanks, Angela.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. And actually, the first of those community events will actually be tonight in Knoxville. So if anybody in the listening area is in Knoxville and would like to join that, just get my email address here at the end, and feel free to reach out and I'll give you more information. So don't forget to submit questions. We have a couple here, but we want to hear from you. If you have questions, I know we had a lot of information that we covered, and we have various staff, and also John Wilson, who's our SACE research director, who is actually on the IRP working group staff. So actually, John, I'm going to direct the first question we have to you. And this question is asking, so do we believe that TVA's calculations involving energy efficiency is another way that TVA will actually justify further power plant expansions or nuclear expansions in the future IRP power generation projections?
Thanks, Angela. If you could jump to slide 9, that would be great, because I think that the first thing to talk about is what is TVA thinking they might be building in this plan. And taking a look at that slide, you'll see, and it's a little hard to review here, but certainly I encourage you to spend some time looking at the plan. The TVA is not actually planning on building a huge number of large power plants. The major type of power plant that they're looking to invest in are the gas combined cycle plants, or gas CC. Those are plants that are typically used to meet that are typically used to cycle but run many hours of the day, and that's really the major investment you see in the plan. And you see that right now TVA lists about 5 gigawatts of resources in that category, and by 2033 they go up to about 6. And so there is a little bit of expansion of power plants in the plan, but at the same time you see coal decreasing substantially. Certainly energy efficiency could help displace some of those power plant needs. The other type of power plant that's being built are peaking plants, gas combined combustion turbine plants. Those are much smaller, less expensive plants. But the major thing that energy efficiency, if it was invested in at the level that we believe it should be invested in, would be to cut back on the unnecessary and expensive burning of natural gas and coal. And by cutting the fuel bill, essentially, for TVA's customers, they help reduce rates and costs to the customers, and they make a more efficient system, one that's less risky in terms of price spikes, and also less risky in terms of engagement with the environmental regulations that are coming forward. So let me see if hopefully that addresses the question. Thanks.
Yep, thanks, John. So our next question, I think Simon, this one's for you. From which other RTOs can TVA take HVDC imports?
The way we have been looking at the HVDC work here recently has been through what projects have been proposed. So HVDC is a bit different than what we've seen in transmission planning in the past, in that these are private companies that are proposing these lines. So it's not as if there's a lot of HVDC proposals or a lot of HVDC proposals out there that would directly plug into TVA, but The Clean Line project for Plains and Eastern would directly tie into the Shelby substation in Memphis, which is a TVA substation. And then the Southern Cross project is meant to have 3 direct ties between TVA, Southern Company, and then also Entergy. At this time, I'm not aware of any other HVDC projects that would come close enough to TVA territory for them to consider, or even for them to model. At least here in the near term. There could be more in the future, but when it comes to HVDC and wind energy, the HVDC lines that connect the plains and interior region of the United States over to the eastern portion of the country are tend to be the most economic projects.
Great, thanks, Simon. So this question, I think, Jonathan, you could handle. It is basically, can we, restate again all the ways that people can submit comments on this plan, various meetings, TVA information, etc.?
Sure. The TVA's IRP webpage has a couple of links. You can submit and file comments online. You can also submit comments at the public meetings that TVA is hosting. They'll have comment cards. At the meeting in Chattanooga, and I believe the meeting in Knoxville, they'll have computers there for folks to actually submit their comments online, and those will be made a part of the record. Comments can also be sent directly to tva@irp.gov, which is an email address. They'll be collecting comments there.
Thanks. Yeah, and also add that SACE, for those who want to submit, for groups perhaps that want to submit their own comments, SACE is planning to share, draft language with folks to put into their comments on these issues. And so if you, as I said, you'll see my email address at the end of this presentation. So if you or your group or anyone that's interested in that, just reach out to me and we'll provide you with that. Another question here is, and perhaps maybe this is for you, John, is can you explain a little more about the sensitivities that TVA will be running after, in this near term?
Sure, thanks. We do know that TVA is planning on doing some additional modeling where they'll look at variations in cost and performance of different resources and other constraints. I don't have a publicly available list of the sensitivities that they are planning to run, and I don't actually even have a confidential definitive list of those sensitivities, so it's something we're very interested in. The two that we're most interested in seeing are examinations of renewable energy and energy efficiency. On renewable energy, the key things we want to see looked at are valuing the HVDC wind resource appropriately in terms of its contribution to resource needs at peak hours. We think it's a very helpful resource during those hours, and we think it was a mistake of TVA to attribute to it the same characteristics as wind from other regions of the country. It's a very unique and well-targeted resource that the HVDC project developers have made possible to deliver to TVA. Also related to that is the cost of wind, and we want to see the costs that TVA is looking at aligned with the market. And we have not seen a demonstration that those costs are aligned. We're really unsure how far off they might be, if they are even off, but our suspicion is that there's a pretty big gap between what TVA's model is looking at in terms of costs and what the market is actually offering to utilities all across the country. The second thing that we're looking for in the sensitivities, and I won't go into the detail here, basically would be some things to look at using more market and best practice assumptions for energy efficiency, and those would address the concerns that Taylor outlined earlier in the presentation. So I'm happy to go into that in some detail if there's a follow-up question on that, but that's the basic idea. Thanks.
Great, thanks. And so maybe, and John, this is for you again perhaps, but going back to slide, let me go to it, slide 9, there is an extra nuclear plant basically showing up in these runs, and I guess the question is, I guess this person knows that there's 7 nuclear plants, which includes the second unit of Watts Bar that's coming on. So wondering if this is showing that there is going to be an additional plant brought on like Bellefonte, or if this is an indication that TVA is moving in the direction of SMRs.
Yeah, I think I'll call your attention on the slide that Angela is showing to the scale there, which is not the number of plants, but it's gigawatts. This excerpt from the IRP probably doesn't make it as clear as if you were reading the actual document. So those are actually, each of those numbers in the table below is in gigawatts. So you're seeing 7 going up to 8, and I believe that's primarily due to Watts Bar 2. So there's not an additional nuclear plant being listed there, and all of those resources there are not listed in the number of units of plants, but in gigawatts, which is a gigawatt, of course, for those who don't know, is 1,000 megawatts or 1,000,000 kilowatts, and that's the scale of the plant's potential output. Thanks.
Okay, we have one final question, which I think I can handle, but if anyone has last-minute questions, please, we're still got about 5 minutes. This question is just specifically asking about the coal plant decisions and the ones that were pre-IRP and why those aren't included in the IRP. So, I mean, John, correct me if I'm wrong, but basically, while the 2011 IRP was still functioning as the roadmap for TVA while it was engaged in the 2015 IRP planning process. And so, as I said before, with the EIS and the 2011 IRP, those are used by TVA to support decisions that are made at the power plants going forward. So the decisions, for example, to scrub the Gallatin plant, to retire the Allen plant, as well as the 2 units at Paradise in Kentucky, all fit within the bounds of the 2011 IRP road, highway, if you will. And the Shawnee plant, which is another old plant that is was uncontrolled for sulfur dioxide emissions, and is an older plant that was actually built to serve a gaseous diffusion plant up in Paducah. Its entire load was delivered there, and so TVA actually doesn't need that local load anymore. And as we've seen through the IRP, through this 2015 draft IRP, their load growth is actually not expected to be very much. And so, we, SACE and allies, disagree with the decision to invest a significant amount of money into the Shawnee coal plant, given that it's basically investing in an old technology for capacity that could be met with clean energy resources. TVA is installing sulfur dioxide scrubbers on units 1 and 4 at Shawnee, which was covered under the 2011 consent decree. Those were decisional units. The rest of the units, they're installing dry sorbent injection, which is another, it's mainly an acid gas controller, but it will remove some SO2 emissions, and so that we have some concerns there as well with what that means for the coal ash, because as you take out more pollution from the stacks, you put it into the ash. So we're fully appreciate TVA's historical movement away from coal in general. As I said, they used to be quite more than half of their generation was coal, so they are moving away, but we look to see more thoughtful analysis with those decisions going forward, because we know that there are cheaper and cleaner ways to meet capacity demand than with propping up old coal plants. So with that being said, no additional questions have come in, so I just want to thank everybody for joining and thank everybody that helped present, and I wanted to go to the end here. So if you have further questions, you kind of digest on this, or if you want to reach out about messaging materials or to find more about the community events, share technical comments, I'm the main point of contact here, so Angela at cleanenergy.org. And I look forward to continuing this conversation. And we had at the last minute a question that I'll shoot out to John really quick. Are there any rooftop solar proposals?
Yes, rooftop solar is studied in the IRP. It's handled in kind of an unusual way, which I think is actually pretty appropriate by TVA. They've gone and they've put it in the model not as a resource alternative, but as different scenarios of future adoption. So TVA sort of makes this distinction, and I think that came up earlier in the presentation, between strategies and scenarios. And so a strategy is something that TVA makes the decision on. A scenario is something that happens in the world, and customers putting solar panels on their roof is something that happens in the world. So if you take a look at what TVA has done, they've looked at different levels of forecast of rooftop solar. We thought the levels that they tested in the model were pretty much reflected the range of likely adoption that's out there, and they've thought about also the potential that some of their policies might influence those choices by customers, but they're also recognizing that the customers are going to be making those choices based on a lot of factors, that many of which are outside of TVA's control. So the solar resource that's in the program really reflects larger customer adoption, such as on big box retail stores or even larger locations or utility scale. But also that resource importantly provides a benchmark, and it says here's what solar is worth to the TVA system. So it doesn't mean the TVA has to buy the solar in the form of a utility scale solar. It also means that TVA can identify that that's the resource they want, and they can find that there's economical ways for them to procure it from rooftops and that sort of thing. So it's a directional guidepost, so to speak, on what the solar resource looks like and what its value is to the system. And then TVA has to then turn that into programs and policies, which is sort of the next step after the IRP. Thanks, Angela.
Great, thanks, John. All right, well, we've hit the hour mark almost perfectly. So once again, feel free to reach out. Comment period, public comment period is until April 27th, and TVA will be coming to a town near you. So we hope to see everybody at these events. And thank you very much. Have a good rest of your day.